So good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Skolnik. I'm an archaeologist with Alexandria Archaeology, which is a department of the Office of Historic Alexandria in Alexandria, Virginia. So we're just up the river from here. In Alexandria, the first excavations into Alexandria's past took place in 1961 out at Fort Ward. And were to serve to inform the reconstructions that would happen at the fort and eventually serve to turn it into a city park. Throughout the 60s and 70s, excavations continued in Old Town as urban renewal redeveloped entire city blocks. In 1977, the city hired an official city archaeologist, and in 1989, it passed an archaeological protection code as part of the city's zoning ordinance, which is one of the first local archaeological protection ordinances in the country. Integral to the implementation of the Alexandria Archaeology Protection Code is a host of sort of in-house spatial research tools that we have. So in the early days, the before times, as I call them, these included the 6-foot-tall map case that we still have, second-hand, hand-off, hand-me-down Sanborn atlases that the library didn't even want anymore. And now we've got about 35 years of paper maps Xeroxed on the copy machine and colored in meticulously with colored pencils that live in map folders. All of this, these sort of paper-based maps were what guided the city and the archaeology department in determining how to implement the Archaeology Protection Code up until about 2005. When we went and procured a grant, the technological know-how didn't exactly exist within the Department of Archaeologists at the time. So we reached out to Virginia Tech's Center for Geospatial Information Technology to help us develop a digital atlas, pull together a couple of historic map sources that allow us to sort of digitize what had been this analog process. The city staff sort of had been trained in how to use GIS, but the creation of it is what they needed assistance with. So as envisioned in 2005 when we wrote this grant, the layers were supposed to encompass a pretty good early slice of Alexandria's history to help us get a handle on what we might expect to find in the ground as construction projects proceed. Initially, the digital atlas was supposed to entail a Civil War era map, a subset of a 1927 aerial survey flown by the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, and a geodatabase of historic features that had already been compiled that lived in some of those paper folders. It was sort of intended from the beginning that this project would be a pilot, and as additional information became available, as additional funds became available, it would be added to, and it would sort of become a living document as time, money, and resources appeared. I sort of took my hand at being a digital archaeologist, and I dove deep into our network space, and I was able to dig up an original copy of the digital atlas circa 2005. And I think you've all had this problem before working with old data sets where stuff gets moved, where there's those little red exclamation points telling you something's wrong. But sort of as visually originally imagined, we had sort of a working document that pulled together a couple of historic resources to help sort of guide city staff in making these determinations. And I think the city of Alexandria is fairly well suited to have sort of a permanent digital atlas like this. Sort of the bread and butter of putting something like this together is the process of georectifying. And I think this morning we heard a pretty good account of some of the problems that when you have historic maps, how difficult it can be sometimes to rectify them. Sort of in the old town part of Alexandria up against the river, our city blocks they've been fairly consistent over the last 250 years, so they haven't moved, and I can rely on a lot of these intersections to use as ground control points. But out on sort of the west end of town, out to Braddock Road and out Duke Street, things get a little hairier. So in 2006 and 2007, we also received additional funding to add to the digital atlas. And we added a couple more Civil War era maps, some layers related to African American heritage in the city, and worked with the city GIS department to add a few more sort of contemporary data sets, roads, building outlines, parcels, things like that. So from this first version of the digital atlas came a working document that sort of would be opened when you had to check something, and you bring data in as it's necessary, you save it and move stuff around, and it very quickly became unwieldy and overgrown, and I've taken steps to protect the identity of the culprit here. But it very quickly becomes not as useful as it could be. In 2015, funding became available to hire an archaeologist / GIS person at Alexandria, myself. And one of the first things that I did was take to the digital atlas and try to clean it up as best I could. So in addition to sort of these very, the initial digital atlas that I inherited, it became sort of one of my standing duties to go out and wherever I could find historic spatial data and bring it into the digital atlas in sort of a controlled, organized format. And I think I should have checked this morning before I came in, but I think we were just past 100 historic maps and aerial photographs covering the current city of Alexandria all in one place. So like many other municipalities, Alexandria has a dedicated GIS office who it's sort of their job to maintain a lot of the infrastructure behind how a municipality like Alexandria manages its digital GIS data. And a lot of the contemporary data sets that they have are also incorporated into the digital atlas. I think I mentioned roads and city parcels already, but also things that, for an archaeologist like myself, sewer lines and underground water lines, fire hydrants, stuff like that that are useful for when determining ground disturbance can proceed. And these have all been integrated into the current digital atlas. Outside of the official city, there are other kinds of spatial data that are useful for sort of such a project. Contemporary LiDAR data, locations of USGS benchmarks, and then these are my two new favorite ones, NOAA's Coastal Wreck and Obstruction Information System, and then some bathymetric surveys. In case you didn't know, we found a ship recently, which this is where my head is submerged underwater stuff. And then to these data, we also have 35 years of other Alexandria Archaeology spatial research, information pulled from the city's small area plans, and then countless volunteers doing research with us in the city. And there's a few more things that I think need to be pulled into the digital atlas before I can put an official digital atlas 2.0 stamp on it. I have a volunteer, Kurt, who's going to speak in a minute about some of his work with our atlas, with some of the aerial photographs from the second half of the 20th century is sort of a gap that we have going forward. But once those come in, and once a couple Sanborn maps the GIS people are working on, not just for us, but also some of the other city departments that use a lot of the same historic data sets that we have, we'll have a fairly stable document that we can come back to and over again that brings together in one place as many historic spatial data sets as we have available to us. Sort of the meat of our atlas are the historic maps that we have available to us. In the last couple of years, there's been not a lack of repositories scanning their collections and putting them up online. A good chunk of what I have comes from the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the David Rumsey map collection. What it represents is a fairly widespread survey into cartography in Alexandria. We have maps made by explorers and traders, property maps, travel atlases and postal delivery maps, coastal surveys, canal and railroad maps, insurance maps, soil maps, and in Alexandria, we have military maps specifically from the Civil War. And it kind of gives us an interesting slice into the history of cartography in our little corner of the world. So we have a couple of maps like this. The one on the top left is U.S. Coastal and Geodetic Survey map from 1863, 64, 65. And if you look really close, you can see field and forest boundaries. this is actually us here at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon's on this map. Or we have the 1877 Hopkins Atlas, which shows us individual buildings in the city, which for some of the work we do is instrumental to what we do. And then other maps aren't as useful for doing sort of that nitty-gritty, fine detailed stuff, but gives us sort of an idea of Alexandria's place in the larger world at the time, and sort of gives us the pulse of what our place in the world is, which when doing a lot of education, a lot of outreach, fielding a lot of questions from the public, having access to maps like these are also useful for us. So I'm going to go through a couple case studies that having our digital atlas, having as many of these sort of this spread of historic resources in one place has allowed us to do. This case study comes from a volunteer. Her name is Anke Webers. She couldn't be here, so I'm going to walk through some of her work. Anke came to us familiar with GIS, looking to volunteer and contribute to our project, but she was sort of a little unsure of how GIS can be used historically, archaeologically. So we drilled down and we found a little project for her to work on, looking at the history of water in Alexandria, looking at water supply and how people get drinking water from one place to another. And we were able to come up with a couple of really interesting historic data sets for her to use. Here are some research questions that she was looking at. Along with the 35 years of previous Alexandria research that we have, we had a volunteer in 1988 put together a list for us compiled from water company records of the first 1,000 addresses in the city to get piped water from the reservoir up on Shooter's Hill. So we have addresses, names, permit numbers, and then the date the permit was issued. So now we have a historic data set that we can tie to space. So what Anke has been looking at with us is what's the history of piped water in Alexandria? How can we look at the distribution, the temporal spread of when people stop having wells in their basements and in their backyards and hook up to this public infrastructure, which is a very interesting question. So hopefully this little video works. If not, I'm just going to click this. Well, maybe it doesn't work. Thoughts? It's all right. Through that's all right. Through ArcGIS's embedded sort of time function, you're able to visualize the distribution of this data, not just in space, X and Y, but also through time as these dots sequentially get added to the maps. And one of the things that Anke is looking into is sort of being able to reconstruct the history of when some of this infrastructure, the city water mains, the earliest city water mains go in based on when these dots show up on our map. So I'm going to introduce Kurt Moser, who is also an Alexandria Archaeology volunteer. And Kurt's been working on some historic landscape ecology for us, looking not at the built infrastructure in the city, but looking at how human activity has been affecting the natural landscape of the city.
Thanks, Ben. I'm looking at 4 Mile Run watershed, which runs kind of from about Falls Church to the southeast and then empties out just below the airport. It's a watershed of about 19.6 square miles that all feeds into 4 Mile Run. And the run itself is about 9 miles in length. And it forms a portion of the boundary between Alexandria and Arlington. For this study, what I am mostly looking at is kind of how the land use and land cover has changed over time and what the ecological effects of those changes has been. There's, some of you may be aware that there's restoration work underway on 4 Mile Run. There's a portion title restoration that was completed just this last spring or summer in the city. And then Arlington is just about to do the groundbreaking on a restoration on the Arlington side, just opposite of that wetland area. So there's a lot of restoration efforts going into place, but understanding kind of what's going on may help inform those restoration efforts. And as you'll see, some of the initial findings of this study actually are probably pretty pertinent to that. We know that 4 Mile Run has changed tremendously over the last 150 plus years. It has gone from a landscape that was largely agricultural to something that's more like 40% impervious surfaces and urban. The graph that's down there shows the US Census data for the years that, well, it's got census data for population as well as for the years that they maintained questions about farmland and what the acreage of farmland was. And you can see that there's kind of a precipitous decline in farming around the same time there's a precipitous increase in population. The impact on the landscape of that has been, through the 20th century, worsening and worsening floods, losses of wetlands, and stream channel alteration, resulting in things like catastrophic flooding. The two photos there are both from 1972, the Hurricane Agnes flooding, and that crushed bridge is the Walter Reed Drive Bridge, which, if you are familiar with it, you wouldn't expect that there would be any circumstance under which the water could take that bridge out, but in fact it did. In 1977, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually built a flood control channel in the lower portion of 4 Mile Run, and so it's unlikely to do any kind of catastrophic flooding like here anymore. But in any case, to look at kind of how things have changed over time and then look at the impact and how it got to that situation, I want to get a sort of an almost decade by decade picture looking back. Would love to be able to look at, kind of how it has changed roughly decade by decade, going back 150 so years. And these are the years that sort of I've got some information for. The ones in bold are the ones that I'm going to show you today. I've got a couple other ones that I've got some work completed on, but those are the ones I'll show you. What I've been working on so far has been looking at contiguous forest patches, so finding spots on the aerial photos that are really uninterrupted forest. They're not residential neighborhoods with trees. They're contiguous, just good habitat kind of forests. And also looking at the path of the stream channels. So if we look at a couple of these, this is the picture in 1927. There you can see there's a little bit of a gap in some of the aerial coverage from 1927, but it's pretty good overall. And the areas that are highlighted in green are the contiguous forested areas. The blue is the stream channel, and the red is the outline of the watershed. And a couple of the things that you can see here are that there's actually pretty decent forested, uninterrupted forested coverage. And the other thing you can see is that the path of the run is kind of wiggly and squiggly, and if you compare that to 1949, it's, again, you see there's a fair amount of forested acreage. It's probably hard to tell here, but I have another slide that I'll show a little bit later, that the path of the stream is actually not quite as sinuous as it had been before. And if we look at closer to present day, this is the 1984. There's a little strip in there that wasn't covered by 1984. That's the 1983 infrared, but it helps to show where the land, what the land cover is. Here you can really see that the forested acreage is pretty small compared to the previous two. And that the stream channel, again, it may be hard to tell here, but the stream channel is a little bit straighter. This is a close-up of some of the stream channel, and this really highlights one of the major differences. This looks at stream tortuosity, or also some people call it sinuosity, and you can see that from 1927, when there was a lot of turning and bending and wiggling, to to more like the present day with the 1984, where it's much straightened. That makes a really big difference because the stream is covering the same distance, but it's using less distance to cover it in, and that means the slope of the stream has changed, and actually the hydrodynamics of the stream have changed. And some of that is due to encroachment on the floodplain and development, and some of that is going to be due to just the fact that more water is running off and it's running faster and it's actually eroding its way through. Some of the initial findings here that are kind of interesting, this incorporates some of the data from a couple of the other intervening years, the 1960, 1971. If you look at forest cover, which is certainly linked a lot of times to stream condition, you can see that the forest cover actually increased going from the 20s to the 40s, and then it's been in decline ever since. The stream tortuosity, however, has been in pretty much steady decline since then. And I think that's very interesting. I think that once I get to the point of doing the land classifications for the other things, there will probably be a clearer relationship between the tortuosity change and some of the other land cover types like agricultural or urban or developed residential land. In any case, one of the outcomes of this then, because the stream tortuosity in particular has become less and less, it's more straight. The slope has increased, and on top of that, the distance covered by the stream as it runs is actually now about 1.5 miles shorter than it was 100 years ago. And that's a really big difference. All those things result in things like higher flow velocities, increased erosion and sediment transport, and changed streambed composition, which leads to an altered ecosystem. My hope is that some of this can inform our understanding of how the landscape was different a long time ago and how that relates to human uses and things like mills, mill dams, and sediment in mill dams, and kind of clarifies some current questions like what can it be restored to. And that's most of what I had to say tonight.
I've got one more case study I want to go through real quick. Was made possible because we have multiple historic data sets all in one place, all georeferenced together. And it comes from this photograph up on top of Shooter's Hill in Alexandria, taken in 1923 of the Masonic Memorial Cornerstone laying. Last summer, or 2 summers ago in 2014, our ongoing excavations came down on this mysterious landscape feature up on top of the hill that it looks a lot like the ha-ha you guys have out by the mansion. It's sort of in the side of the hill. These pictures don't really do a good job of explaining what it looks like. But it's sort of into the side of the hill. It's kind of flat, and then there's this really steep slope, and it kind of slopes off to the top. And we have another 18th century mansion on top of the hill that we know George Washington spent a night at once, and like most of the other houses around here. But we were thinking, we don't really have a good handle on what this archaeological feature is. What kind of things might it be? When we came and we saw this historic photograph, and if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner, there was this sort of large mound of this gentleman standing next to, and the cars are parked at the bottom of, and we thought, this looks like it's about in the same spot. Maybe we're sort of catching the very edge of this large mound. And in order to test that hypothesis, we sort of needed to know where this photograph was taken from. The elevation, it looks like the photographer sort of up off the ground, and there's a couple of houses and garages sort of behind where we were working that we're thinking maybe the photographer climbed up on one of these garages or leaned out the window and took a photograph from there, in which case that mound is about where this mysterious landscape feature is, and then we would have a good case for it. So what I did is, and I'm going to preface all of this by saying I don't really understand a lot of the optics or the physics behind this, so maybe the photogrammetry people, I can come and talk to you. Or if I say something that's absolutely wrong, just throw your hand up and I'll sit down and be quiet for now. But what I did is I took a series of foresights and back sights in the photo, sort of operating from the assumption that there's something in between, something in the background and something, the camera, then that thing is on a straight line between it. So if you look, these lines I drew are known positions in the background that I can see either in the 1927 aerial photograph that we have or other similar period historic maps, and things that are directly between that object and the camera that I also know the locations of. And I have a series of 8 of these foresight backsites, and I went and mapped them. And I assume this works because they all converge at a single point. And it looks like that this photograph was taken from this position on the hill. And you can see there, we've been digging there so long that our excavation's on Google Earth. But you can see that these lines converge sort of forward towards the base of the hill rather than further back where we thought it might be taken from. We sort of conclude that in order to take a picture of this mound, you couldn't have taken it from this spot and catch this mysterious landscape feature that we have. So as is sort of the case with these kind of things, once you sort of find out what your answer is, you find something else and you go, oh yeah, why didn't I just look at that first? So we came across this other construction map, and there underneath of the convergence there it says there's a water tower. And we said, oh, we should have looked at that first. And then when you go and you look at the rest of these photographs, this is the same day, the same event taken from the opposite side, looking up the hill. And if you look way up in the distance there, up on top of the hill, there's our water tower. And if it was a little bit less grainy, I'm sure you'd see our photographer up on top of that hill. So we were able to use a couple of early 20th century data sets to tell us that this mysterious landscape feature is still a mystery to us. But we were able to rule out one of our hypotheses, which I guess stands for something. So in conclusion, let me wrap up and say that having a tool like this that takes upwards of 100 now historic maps and aerial photographs has been instrumental to an agency that sort of has its duty of monitoring, administrating an archaeological protection code inside the City of Alexandria. So cities, counties, places like Mount Vernon, I imagine you guys have something similar. Being able to pull all those together into one spot, you're able to sort of leverage the strengths of a lot of them, and then the gaps and weaknesses and others you can sort of fill in and work your way around. So thank you very much.
All right, and we have a couple minutes for questions for Ben, so if anybody has any, I'll circulate around the room.
The 4-mile run is roughly coincident with the Washington and Old Dominion rail line. I wondered, did you have rail maps as well to help your study?
Yeah, when the railroad comes in, we start getting a lot of really the first good historic look at the surrounding area. So first when the canals come in, a generation before, and then when the railroads come in, we see a couple maps that go along with those. There is, I think the Washington Old Dominion trolley line has a series that's on the list of things I need to add afterwards. I don't know, Kurt, did you use any of the railroad maps?
Not yet, but I haven't gotten to the maps yet. Most of the stuff I've been working on has been aerial copies, so the maps is next. I've been kind of working from middle out.
One of the things that we have talked about is at the mouth of 4-mile run, where now Route 1 and the Parkway, and then previously there was a railroad bridge over it. We've been looking at how sort of the construction of those bridges has altered the water course, maybe adding to sedimentation behind the bridge as sort of it hits the embankment and sort of slows down, drops sediment, and moves out.
I wanted to ask Kurt, do you have a way, or how do you explain the increase in the amount of contiguous forests during a time when the population was dramatically increasing?
That's a fantastic question. And if it wasn't picked up, it was the question of why has the forest increased, during that time, especially at a time when the population was increasing tremendously. And it's an interesting one. I am looking forward to seeing the 1937 series because that should help clarify the picture a little bit. My suspicion is actually that with the decline in farming, one of the things I've noted from the aerial photographs is that even going maybe 1 decade or not even 2 decades, you can go from what is clearly a farmed field to what is clearly forested. And so I suspect that the issue here is, even though the population was growing, there were enough farm fields that had essentially been abandoned. I mean, they may not have been abandoned, but they were no longer being farmed, and they reverted to forest. And I think that that's kind of what explains that. But like I say, I think the 1937 picture is going to be the one that actually helps clarify that a lot, because it fills in the gap, and we'll be able to see some of the forests that are coming in on some of those fields.
Hi, this is another question for Kurt. I was just curious why 4 Mile Run, which is about 9 miles long, is called 4 Mile Run.
Also a good question.
Actually, I'm wondering that too. On my walk, there's a sign that says
So
5.
there has, it's an interesting question, because it has been, at one point it was speculated that somebody had, it was called Flour Mill Run, and that it had been, it fell across the fold in a map and somebody read it wrong or something like that. But I don't think that's very likely. That's been kind of a speculative one. It's more that it's 4 miles above the mouth of Great Hunting Creek. So similar to how a lot of, there's a lot of other places in the country that are named that way. There's some landmark spot, and then the run that's above it is 8 Mile Run, and then there's 19 Mile Run, and there's all these things. I'm pretty sure that's it. And I mentioned that it runs about 9 miles. It's interesting looking at the aerial photography, because it doesn't go, you can only follow it so far before it kind of vanishes into where you can't tell exactly where the channel is. So the tracings that I've got of the channel are pretty much as far as I can follow the channel. That tends to be less than the 9 miles that's understood to be the length of 4 Mile Run. But within that, then it runs a longer distance because it curves back and forth, and it's a little bit, even now, is a little bit sinuous. It's not quite as much as it used to be.
All right, well, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing more from the Digital Atlas in years to come.